came from railway terminology. A Red Ball freight was an express shipment that took priority over everything else. The Red Ball Express would operate on the same principle: absolute priority, no delays, no exceptions. The technical specifications defied German military doctrine. Two parallel one-way highways, one for loaded trucks going forward, one for empties returning. 24-hour operations with headlights blazing, abandoning blackout discipline. No stop policy except for fuel and mechanical failure. 5-minute convoy intervals, maintaining 35 mph average speed. Mobile maintenance units every 50 hours. MP checkpoints removing any vehicle below 25 miles per hour. Colonel Charles O. Thrasher, commanding the advanced section of ADSE, Advanced Section Communication Zone, reviewed the projected numbers. We need 140 truck companies, 5,958 vehicles minimum, operating at 90% availability. That's impossible by any logistics textbook ever written. Yet within 36 hours, the impossible was operational. On August 26, 1944, drivers from the 3-out 916 Quartermaster Truck Company climbed into their GMC CCKW 2 1-2-ton trucks, nicknamed the Deuce and a Half, loaded with 105 mm artillery shells, bound for Patton's guns at Mellon, 300 Mechersis East. The demographic composition of the Red Ball Express would have stunned German racial theorists. Of the 23,000 drivers who would eventually operate the route, approximately 75% were African-American soldiers serving in a still segregated army. These men, who couldn't eat in white restaurants or use white facilities in much of America, were keeping the most celebrated white general's army in motion. The drivers developed their own culture within hours. They painted slogans on their trucks: Patton's Blood Bank, Hitler, here we come, Detroit to Berlin Express. They created their own traffic rules. Slower vehicles pulled off immediately. Mechanical failures were pushed into ditches. Any truck below 26 mph was considered a roadblock. By August 28th, German reconnaissance units began reporting something unprecedented. Units from Aufklärung 116 radioed from positions overlooking the main Red Ball route. Continuous vehicle column, headlights visible for 20 km. No spacing, no blackout discipline. Estimate 1,000 vehicles per hour. Americans have abandoned all military precaution. This violated everything German military doctrine taught. Headlights at night invited air attack. Continuous columns presented perfect artillery targets. No spacing between vehicles meant a single disabled truck could halt an entire convoy. Yet the Americans seemed unconcerned. General Lieutenant Edgar Feuinger, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, personally observed the Red Ball Express from concealed positions on August 30th. His report to Army Group B headquarters reflected growing alarm. The enemy operates a supply system beyond our comprehension. Vehicles pass at 30-second intervals, day and night, without pause. They don't hide, don't disperse, don't follow any rules we understand. It's not military science. It's mass production applied to warfare. What the Germans couldn't understand was that American logistics operated on different principles entirely. Where German doctrine emphasized concealment, Americans relied on volume. Where Germans conserved vehicles, Americans assumed 20% mechanical failure and planned accordingly. Where Germans followed strict military procedure, Americans improvised continuously. ChatGPT John Noy, August 19, 1944. The air was thick with the palpable tension of a war that had stretched every human and material resource to its limit. In the heart of East Prussia, within the solid walls of the Wehrmacht headquarters, General Oberst Alfred Jodl pored over the latest intelligence reports. A shadow of anxiety hung over him as he reviewed the progress of the Allied forces, their advance moving with the relentlessness of a storm, their speed defying every assumption he had held about warfare. The Western Front was collapsing, but the mathematic calculations from his staff were unequivocal. Patton's Third Army, which had surged ahead, now found itself at a dangerous precipice. The numbers had been calculated with brutal precision. 400 miles from the Normandy beaches, Patton's tanks were racing ahead, their engines roaring through the French countryside, the thickest of fogs hanging in the morning air like a veil of doom. The Americans had outrun their supply lines. The supply depots that were meant to sustain this momentum were 400 miles behind. No army, no matter how powerful, could sustain such an advance without fuel. Yodel's mind was racing with these calculations, his mind sharp but growing faint as he thought of the devastating truth. An armored division, in its relentless march, consumed 150,000 gallons of fuel every day. At this speed, they would grind to a halt. General Jodl could practically hear the wheels of his soldiers' defeat creaking under the strain of logistics. The calculations seemed undeniable. Patton's army would inevitably slow down, perhaps within days or even hours. A halt at the Seine, a regrouping at Winter. This, Jodl believed, was the logical end, and the Wehrmacht, already weary from their constant retreats, would have time to reassess, to rebuild their strength. It was the only possibility in his mind. What Jodl did not know was that 125 miles to the west, 558 trucks were already rumbling across the French countryside, their headlights cutting through the darkness in defiance of military doctrine. These trucks, part of an audacious logistical operation dubbed the Red Ball Express, were carrying 12,500 tons of supplies every 24 hours, pushing the limits of what any military strategist could imagine. The convoy, so audacious, so fast, and so relentless, was about to defy every assumption the Germans held about warfare. The logistical nightmare they believed would strangle the Allies would instead become the very artery that pumped life into their advance. Within 72 hours, Patton's tanks, already seen as immovable by the Germans, would once again be in full motion, their tracks tearing through the Seine. Within a week, they would liberate Paris. In a month, they would be standing at the very gates of Germany. And all of this would be thanks to an unassuming group of 23,000 drivers, 75% of whom were African American soldiers, men who, despite being segregated in a still divided army, would drive these convoys at an unthinkable pace. The engine of victory would not only be fueled by gasoline, but by a spirit of perseverance, grit, and courage. Each truck loaded with supplies, ready to bring victory to the Allied forces. For General Jodl and his fellow generals, the numbers they had so confidently relied upon, and the strategies they had held sacred, were about to be shattered in a way they couldn't possibly have foreseen. The Red Ball Express, the logistical miracle of WWII, would change the way warfare was understood and would become one of the most surprising and unprecedented successes in military history. As the convoys continued to move at full throttle, the Germans were left scrambling, trying to make sense of an operation that defied all their teachings. It was as if, overnight, their entire doctrine of warfare had been rendered irrelevant. What followed would become a tale of American ingenuity and relentless human spirit, where the very concept of victory would be changed forever. The Germans couldn't grasp the speed at which the Americans operated. They couldn't fathom the scale of what was unfolding before them. The Red Ball Express was a chain connecting the Allies' forces across the vast expanse of occupied France, each truck a link in a story of military evolution, of defying every obstacle with sheer force of will. They couldn't escape it, this unstoppable advance, powered by speed, volume, and an unwillingness to stop. But as the wheels of progress continued to turn, the true weight of what was at stake was becoming clearer. The Germans were on the back foot. Jodl's belief that Patton's forces would falter, slow, and cease their advance was a belief now in tatters. This logistical lifeline would carry the Americans through the heart of France, breaking through defenses thought impenetrable. and in the wake of their unstoppable force, the myth of German superiority in warfare would begin to crumble. It was no longer a battle of just tanks, soldiers, or planes. It was a battle of ideas, and the Americans had just won a decisive victory on the battlefield of logistics. As the convoys stretched for miles, the Red Ball Express became a symbol of American resilience, of what could be achieved when willpower and resources collided in a perfect storm. And General Jodl, along with the German command, were left to reckon with the realization that logistics, the very thing they had once deemed their enemies, undoing, had become the key to Allied success. They had underestimated the Americans. They had underestimated the capacity for innovation and determination. And ultimately, they had underestimated what it truly meant to keep an army in motion. The rest of the war from this moment on would never be the same. And that was the moment the world began to change. The Red Ball Express, a logistical operation that became one of the most unexpected and unprecedented feats of World War II, shattered German expectations in a way that no military strategist could have foreseen. The first week of the operation, from August 25th to 31st, 1944, set a pace that was as audacious as it was effective. In that short span, 89,939 tons of supplies were delivered, an average of 12,948 tons daily, stretching the distance of 686 miles in round trips. The trucks, 5,958 in total, made 1.5 trips daily, while the operation consumed a staggering 300,000 gallons of fuel just to maintain the flow of supplies. The German military had long believed that logistical impossibilities were their enemies' undoing. They had seen it in Russia, where the Wehrmacht faltered not from Soviet resistance, but from the simple inability to supply forces across vast distances. German military doctrine emphasized careful planning, strict schedules, and methodical procedures. Yet the Red Ball Express had thrown these principles aside. Convoys departed every 5 minutes, each one an embodiment of relentless motion, a testament to American efficiency. It was not just a matter of sheer numbers. The convoys were made up of 67 vehicle units, each carrying 5 tons of supplies, sometimes as much as 7 tons, regularly overloaded. The trucks traversed 350 miles, averaging 14 hours on the road with only 2-hour turnarounds. The volume of traffic was staggering. At any given moment, 5,000 vehicles were in motion, a continuous flow of life-giving fuel, ammunition, and rations, moving forward without pause. There was no time to waste, no room for error. When mechanical failures occurred, a common problem in wartime transport, mobile maintenance units sprang into action. In just 15 minutes, they would perform triage repairs, cannibalizing parts from damaged trucks to keep the system moving. In cases of more severe damage, engines were swapped in less than 45 minutes using mobile cranes. When bridges were destroyed, makeshift bypasses were built, using rubble from bombed buildings to create new paths for the trucks. The men of the Red Ball Express made the impossible happen with ingenuity and grit. German military strategists, upon hearing these reports, were flabbergasted. This was not the logistical failure they had expected. This wasn't warfare by the book. It wasn't the carefully calculated advance they had anticipated. It was an industrial juggernaut on wheels, moving forward faster than they could react. The sheer volume of the operation, the reckless speed, the abandonment of military. Discipline. It was chaos, and it worked. The Germans couldn't comprehend it. Their trucks broke down on Russian roads. Their wagons, still relying on horses, were slow and inefficient. Meanwhile, the Americans, with a system that seemed to violate every principle of military science, were delivering supplies at an unprecedented rate. Fuel consumption, which they thought would cripple the Americans, became an astonishing feat of logistical management. The Red Ball Express consumed more gasoline daily, 300,000 gallons, than some German armies did for all purposes. Yet, there were never any shortages. By September 1944, the fuel system that powered the Red Ball Express had been further reinforced by Operation Pluto, a secret pipeline that ran under the English Channel, delivering fuel directly to the front lines. The Germans, even after years of espionage, had no knowledge of these pipelines. Forward fuel dumps, strategically placed every 25 miles, ensured that no vehicle went more than 10 minutes without refueling. The Germans were helpless in the face of this logistical miracle. The forward progress of Patton's forces was nothing short of astonishing. The 4th Armored Division, for example, advanced 35 miles in one day, and by noon, after a quick refueling, it advanced another 32 miles. This single-day advancement shattered German expectations, which had set a maximum of 30 miles per day for an armored division's advance. When Patton's forces were supplied by the Red Ball Express, they managed more than twice that, 60 miles a day for a week, completely upending German military planning. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, reviewing the reports in East Prussia, initially refused to believe them. No armored force could move 60 miles a day for an entire week. The mechanical failures alone should have brought the operation to a halt. It simply wasn't possible. But as more intercepted radio traffic confirmed the unimaginable feats, his disbelief turned to alarm. The Germans were confronting not just a superior army, but a superior civilization, a civilization with seemingly infinite resources. The Americans were not just defeating the Germans on the battlefield, they were overwhelming them with logistics, with the sheer power of industrial might. But it wasn't just the German generals who were baffled. The men driving the trucks, the 23,000 drivers of the Red Ball Express, had no textbook to follow. They were creating their own rules, their own culture. Slogans painted on the sides of trucks, such as Patton's Blood Bank and Detroit to Berlin Express, were a testament to their determination. And these men, many of them African-American soldiers who had been denied equal rights at home, understood the significance of their work. Every mile they drove was a blow to the racist ideologies of the enemy they were fighting. It wasn't just the victory that was important. It was the process, the resilience, the ingenuity, the disregard for traditional rules that caught the attention of German observers. The Germans could hear the trucks rolling at all hours of the night. They could hear the endless engines, the endless supplies, and they understood. It wasn't about superior tactics. It wasn't about hidden movements or stealth. It was about relentless volume, resources in motion, unyielding and unstoppable. The Germans had 3 rounds per rifle. The Americans had millions. The sound of that never-ending supply line became psychological warfare. The trucks themselves were marvels of engineering. The GMCC CCKW2 1-2-ton truck, which became the backbone of the Red Ball Express, was a product of mass production. By the end of the war, General Motors had produced over 500,000 of these trucks, more than the entire German military had of any vehicle. These trucks had all-wheel drive as a standard automatic tire inflation systems and engines that could run on low-quality fuel without modification. They could move across rough terrain and into areas where other vehicles couldn't reach. The Germans were amazed at the durability and versatility of the vehicles. American maintenance philosophy was also unlike anything the Germans had encountered. When a German truck broke down, it was meticulously repaired. But Americans didn't bother with repairs in the same way. If a truck broke down, they replaced it. If a part was damaged, they discarded the whole vehicle rather than trying to fix it. Thousands of competent mechanics were available to perform 80% of repairs right in the field. The Americans didn't just move supplies. They adapted, they innovated, and they did it at a speed that left the Germans bewildered. As the Red Ball Express continued to move, the speed at which it operated stunned German intelligence. The convoys were constant, day and night. They moved through fog, rain, and snow, never stopping. The Germans simply couldn't keep up. They could hear the trucks, but they couldn't stop them. The Americans had turned logistics into a a weapon that could move faster than the enemy could react. And so, as the Red Ball Express continued to operate with a relentless pace, the Germans watched as their plans unraveled. The very logistics they had relied on, the systems they had thought were invulnerable, were being overwhelmed by sheer volume, by the American will to succeed. The world would soon see the fruits of this innovation. Patton's forces would smash through German lines, liberating Paris and, soon after, pushing into Germany. It wasn't just the tanks, the soldiers, or the weapons. It was the supply lines, the lifeblood of the American forces, that would ultimately lead to victory. And the Germans knew they couldn't stop it. The Red Ball Express, the incredible logistical operation that defied all odds, not only shocked the German military, but also became a symbol of American ingenuity and resolve. Starting in late August 1944, the scale of its success would forever alter the Germans' perception of warfare. The Americans, having been pushed to the limits of logistics in their drive through France, needed to supply Patton's Third Army with a steady stream of supplies to keep the momentum going. But this was no ordinary supply line. It was a living, breathing beast that moved faster and more efficiently than anything the Germans had ever expected. In the first week alone, from August 25th to 31st, the Red Ball Express delivered an astonishing 89,939 tons of supplies. The convoys averaged 12,148 tons per day, all while covering a round-trip distance of 686 miles. 5,958 trucks were in constant motion, running at full capacity, making 1.5 trips each day and consuming 300,000 gallons of fuel just to keep the operation going. The numbers were mind-boggling, and to the German officers, they seemed to defy the laws of logistics. The Germans had long believed that such an operation, especially one run by a largely untested army, was an impossibility. Their own supply lines, even with decades of experience and meticulous planning, had often faltered in the face of resistance, particularly during their campaigns in Russia. And now, they were faced with an operation where the rules of their own doctrine were being thrown aside. They had calculated that Patton's rapid advance would come to a grinding halt once the supply lines could no longer keep up. But what they didn't anticipate was the speed and efficiency of the Red Ball Express. For the Germans, logistics had always been about precision and control, methods that could be planned down to the last detail. Their doctrine relied on carefully executed methodical processes, and when faced with an unrelenting American supply operation, they were left reeling. The Americans weren't just moving supplies, they were breaking every established norm. Convoys departed every 5 minutes without hesitation, often consisting of 67 vehicles, and covering an average of 350 miles in 14 hours. The turnaround time at each end was just 2 hours. There was no waiting, no pauses. Trucks kept rolling. And when a truck broke down, which, given the pace, was a frequent occurrence, American mechanics would leap into action, often repairing the vehicles in minutes, while others had already passed them by. What was most remarkable to the Germans, though, wasn't just the speed at which the Red Ball Express operated, but the sheer volume of supplies it was delivering. The Americans weren't just sustaining their forces, they were outpacing their own consumption. The Germans had never seen such a thing in warfare. They were accustomed to rationing, to carefully managing their limited resources, but the Americans were running a system where they didn't have to ration, where they could afford to waste. While the Germans were used to scraping by with what little they had, the Americans had an endless supply. And it wasn't just about the trucks. It was about the fuel, the manpower, the infrastructure, all of it working in perfect harmony. By September 5th, the Red Ball Express was running like a well-oiled machine. Despite the German belief that such a supply line could never function under the pressures of warfare, the Americans were proving them wrong. The convoys kept rolling, the trucks kept delivering, and the supplies kept flowing, faster than ever. The Germans watched in disbelief as their own systems of control crumbled in the face of American efficiency. But what made the situation even more astounding was the realization that the Americans had no intention of slowing down. The fuel, once thought to be a limiting factor, never ran dry. While the Germans had been preparing for the Americans to stumble over their own fuel shortages, the Red Ball Express created a logistical marvel of its own, Operation Pluto. This covert operation laid fuel pipelines across the English Channel, providing the Red Ball Express with an unbroken stream of fuel supplies. The Germans, oblivious to the existence of this pipeline, continued to believe that fuel shortages would eventually cripple the Americans. But by the time they realized the truth, it was too late. The true power of the Red Ball Express lay not only in its ability to maintain an impossible pace, but also in its adaptability. American engineers and mechanics made improvisation an art form. When roads became impassable or bridges were destroyed, they didn't slow down. They rebuilt the roads and bridges themselves, often within a matter of hours. They created bypasses and alternative routes, using whatever resources were available. And when they encountered problems, they didn't hesitate to find creative solutions. It was this spirit of resourcefulness that allowed the Red Ball Express to overcome obstacles that would have stymied any other military. German observers, tasked with monitoring the Red Ball Express, couldn't fathom how the Americans were managing it all. To them, it was an affront to everything they had been taught about logistics. The Americans weren't following the rules, and yet they were succeeding. They were using more fuel than the Germans ever thought possible. They were discarding damaged vehicles, and they were running an operation without the careful planning that had been drilled into the German officers for years. And yet, they were winning. This was more than just a logistical operation. It was a psychological blow. The Germans, who had once prided themselves on their military precision and efficiency, now saw the Americans outdoing them in every way. The sound of the trucks moving day and night, the constant hum of engines and wheels turning, became a symbol of American superiority. The Germans couldn't keep up, and they knew it. And yet, despite the overwhelming success of the Red Ball Express, it wasn't without its costs. The drivers, many of whom were African-American soldiers, worked tirelessly in grueling conditions. They drove for days on end, often hallucinating from exhaustion, relying on stimulants to keep going. Accidents were common, and many drivers lost their lives in the process. But through it all, morale remained high. These men, many of whom had been denied rights at home, understood the significance of their work. They were not just delivering supplies, they were fighting racism with every mile they drove, proving Hitler's racial theories wrong with each turn of the wheel. For the men of the Red Ball Express, this was about more than just logistics. It was about showing the world that they were capable of greatness, that they could overcome the odds and accomplish the impossible. Every mile they drove, every ton of supplies they delivered, was a testament to their resilience, their ingenuity, and their defiance of the very ideology that sought to degrade them. As the war continued to unfold, the impact of the Red Ball Express was felt far beyond the front lines. German soldiers, who had once been confident in their superiority, now began to question their own abilities in the face of such a relentless supply system. They saw the trucks moving constantly, saw the Americans pouring resources into their war effort with no end in sight, and they knew they were losing. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply line. It was a symbol of American power, of American industrial might, and of American determination. It was a force that the Germans simply couldn't match. And so, as the American forces pushed forward, liberating Paris and advancing toward Germany, the Red Ball Express continued to operate, its wheels turning in defiance of the German military's expectations. The Americans had not just outpaced their enemies, they had left them in the dust. And as the world would soon learn, it was logistics, not just firepower, that would ultimately win the war. The Red Ball Express, a name now synonymous with logistical brilliance, was the lifeblood that kept the American Third Army advancing during the intense summer of 1944. For the Germans, This logistical miracle shattered every preconceived notion they had about warfare. In a time when the Wehrmacht's supply lines had already been strained to their breaking point, the Americans were proving that logistics, far from being a weak point in their military machine, was their greatest strength. And they did so with a mix of sheer determination, industrial might, and a disregard for the rules of conventional warfare. For the Germans, it was nothing short of a revelation, and a nightmare. As the Red Ball Express took shape, the Germans were still clinging to their traditional ideas about military logistics. They had watched as the American forces, led by General Patton, had advanced farther, faster, and with more tenacity than any army they had ever faced. The Germans, who had once been masters of blitzkrieg tactics, now faced a force they could not outmaneuver or outlast. The problem was not the Americans' ability to fight, but their ability to sustain their fight, something that the Germans had always taken for granted. The Red Ball Express defied every assumption about the limitations of supply lines. From August 25th to 31st, 1944, an astounding 89,939 tons of supplies were delivered. The convoys were operating at full capacity, with 5,958 trucks making 1.5 trips per day. Each truck averaged a staggering 12,148 tons per day, covering 686 miles. And yet, despite the immense logistical challenges, the American supply line showed no signs of slowing down. For the Germans, this was not just an impressive feat. It was a logistical assault on everything they knew about warfare. But the true brilliance of the Red Ball Express lay not just in its scale, but in its adaptability. The operation evolved rapidly, creating new routes as needed, responding to roadblocks, damaged bridges, and other obstacles with unmatched speed and efficiency. White Ball Express, Green Diamond, and Red Lion, these were just a few of the new routes that appeared almost overnight, each one operational within 48 hours of conception. The Germans, with their meticulous planning and strategic precision, were left dumbfounded. For them, such rapid adaptability was beyond their imagination. German officers, who had spent their careers studying the logistics of war, couldn't fathom how the Americans were managing it. The Red Ball Express was run with a decentralized, almost chaotic approach, but it worked. Every detail, from the rotation of trucks to the creation of maintenance stations, was done on the fly, with no time for detailed planning meetings or preemptive discussions. It was the antithesis of the German military approach, which was rooted in preparation and careful execution. And yet, it worked. The Americans had created something that was faster, more efficient, and ultimately unstoppable. The operation's success was built on an unwavering belief in the concept of industrial abundance, something that was foreign to the Germans. While the Wehrmacht had spent years perfecting the art of efficiency, the Americans simply didn't care about the waste. They understood that the speed and volume of their logistics would overwhelm any shortcomings. The trucks kept rolling, the convoys kept moving, and no amount of mechanical failure, poor weather, or enemy action could halt their progress. For the Germans, it was a crushing blow to their pride. They had spent years developing their own logistics systems, building infrastructure and supply lines that they believed were the epitome of military efficiency. And now, they were witnessing the Americans, who they had once underestimated, achieving what they had deemed impossible. The sound of the Red Ball trucks, constantly moving day and night, became a constant reminder to the Germans that they were losing. But what was even more unsettling for the Germans was the realization that the Red Ball Express was not just a logistical operation. It was a psychological weapon. The Germans, who had long held the belief that their military was superior to all others, could not comprehend the Americans' ability to defy every rule of warfare and still succeed. They were watching their worldview collapse, one truck at a time. In addition to its physical and logistical achievements, the Red Ball Express also became a symbol of defiance against the Nazi regime's racial theories. The operation relied heavily on African American soldiers, men who had been denied equal rights in their own country, but were now driving the wheels of the American war machine. These men, often segregated and barred from combat roles, were now proving their worth not just as soldiers, but as logistical masterminds. They were fighting racism with every mile they drove, every ton of supplies they delivered. German racial theorists, who had long preached the inferiority of African Americans, were faced with a contradiction they could not explain. How could these men, whom they considered inferior, be the ones responsible for delivering the vast majority of supplies to the front lines? How could they perform logistics miracles that the Germans couldn't even dream of? This forced a reckoning in the minds of German officers and soldiers alike, who could not comprehend the success of the Red Ball Express and the men behind it. As the months passed, the Red Ball Express continued to evolve, and the Americans began to push further into Germany. The operation expanded, with even more trucks and drivers joining the effort. Yet despite the increasing demands and the mounting mechanical failures, the Red Ball Express never slowed down. It became a symbol of American resolve, of their ability to adapt and innovate under the most difficult conditions. For the Germans, it was a constant reminder that they were fighting a force they could not defeat. The Red Ball Express not only kept the Americans supplied, but also reinforced their belief in their ability to win the war. The Germans, on the other hand, began to see their own logistical systems fail. Their confidence in their superiority was being shattered, one truckload at a time. By the time the Red Ball Express reached its peak, the Germans had no choice but to acknowledge its success. They were defeated not just by American tanks and planes, but by an industrial logistics system that they couldn't even begin to replicate. The Red Ball Express had proven that in modern warfare, logistics was not just a support function, it was the key to victory. The Germans, who had spent years perfecting their own logistical systems, were now witnessing the overwhelming power of American industry, and it was more than they could handle. The impact of the Red Ball Express reached far beyond the battlefields of Europe. It would go on to revolutionize logistics worldwide, laying the foundation for the modern transportation and supply systems we rely on today. And for the men who made it all possible, the drivers, the engineers, the mechanics, it was a moment of glory, a testament to the power of human ingenuity and determination. The Red Ball Express didn't just supply an army, it supplied an ideology. It was proof that, when faced with seemingly insurmountable odds, the Americans could adapt, innovate, and prevail. The Germans, who had once been the masters of logistics, were now looking at a system that was faster, more efficient, and, most importantly, unstoppable. In the end, it wasn't just about the supplies or the trucks. It was about the men who made it happen, the men who defied every expectation and showed the world that nothing was impossible. The Red Ball Express was not just a supply line, it was a statement. And as the Americans rolled forward, their trucks became the symbol of victory, of resilience, and of a future where logistics, not just military might, would win the war. The Red Ball Express, in the annals of World War II, stands as one of the most remarkable feats of logistics the world has ever known. When it began, no one, least of all the Germans, could have fathomed how a mere system of supply trucks could change the course of the war. But change it did, in ways no one could have predicted, even with the full might of the Wehrmacht staring across the battlefield. By September 1944, the Red Ball Express was operating at full throttle, proving to the Germans and to the rest of the world that logistics was just as important as tanks, planes, or infantry. In fact, it would be fair to say that in modern warfare, logistics would become the defining factor that decided the winner. At the heart of this audacious operation were the men behind the wheel, the 23,000 soldiers, most of them African American, who made it all possible. In a segregated army, these men had been relegated to non-combat roles, denied the recognition their white counterparts received, and yet they played a pivotal role in an operation that would, in the end, reshape military logistics forever. It was their sweat, their fatigue, and their resilience that kept the war machine moving, day and night, even when everything else seemed to be falling apart. And then there were the numbers that even today seem almost impossible to believe. In the operation's first week alone, from August 25th to 31st, the Red Ball Express delivered 89,939 tons of supplies, averaging nearly 13,000 tons per day. The convoy made round trips of up to 686 miles, and the trucks were rolling continuously, moving supplies faster than the Wehrmacht could ever have anticipated. This relentless pace, powered by an astonishing 5,958 trucks, each making an average of 1.5 trips a day, stunned the Germans. German officers, after studying the reports, dismissed them as Allied propaganda. They couldn't fathom the scale, the speed, or the sheer audacity of what the Americans had done. Yet, the Red Ball Express was not a myth. It was a real, living, breathing entity, a logistical juggernaut that redefined the very idea of military support. German intelligence even went as far as to track American fuel consumption and vehicle rotations, but their calculations were always off, always too conservative. By the time September 5th arrived, the Red Ball Express had established an operational rhythm that seemed impossible to the German staff officers who had been taught their entire careers to rely on slow, methodical planning. The Americans had built, reinforced, and maintained 40 bridges, created 15 major fuel depots, and constructed 26 maintenance stations, all while the operation was running smoothly. The rapid creation of these facilities, often completed overnight, was a direct contrast to the painstakingly slow operations the Germans were accustomed to. In one particularly stunning display of American ingenuity, engineers repaired a destroyed bridge in just 14 hours, a task that, according to German calculations, should have taken at least 6 weeks. Where the Germans saw insurmountable obstacles, the Americans saw opportunities. They used rubble from bombed buildings to build bypass roads around destroyed bridges, ensuring that the convoys kept moving. What was even more incredible was the fact that these feats were being accomplished by men who had been denied equal rights at home. African American soldiers, segregated in both civilian life and the military, were the backbone of the Red Ball Express. Yet, in the midst of a war fought for freedom, these soldiers were proving that, when given the tools and the opportunity, they could outpace, outthink, and outperform their enemies. They knew they were fighting not just for the Allied cause, but for their own dignity. Each mile driven, every load delivered, was a repudiation of the racist ideologies that the Nazis had tried to impose on the world. As German prisoners were forced to work alongside these drivers, they saw the truth for themselves. Many of them stood silent at prison camp fences, watching the trucks roll by. Some wept. They had been taught to believe in Aryan superiority, but here, in front of them, was a group of men who were doing something their own military could not. These men were proving Hitler wrong, one truck at a time. And that was a reality that the Germans could not simply ignore. The Red Ball Express was not just a logistical operation. It was a living, breathing example of American exceptionalism. The German generals, who had spent their entire careers studying logistics and supply chains, were now watching as the Americans tore down everything they had ever believed in. Their own supply lines had failed in Russia, grinding to a halt as their resources were stretched thin. But the Americans, despite having fewer resources and less time, were able to keep their army moving forward at a pace the Germans could only dream of. And it wasn't just the volume of supplies that left the Germans in awe. It was the speed and efficiency with which those supplies were delivered. The Red Ball Express was operating on a scale that the Germans could not even conceive. Convoys departed every 5 minutes, each one carrying 5 tons of supplies, and the trucks kept rolling, no matter the weather, no matter the obstacles. German observers were left dumbfounded as they watched the endless stream of trucks moving forward, their headlights blazing in the night, violating every rule of wartime protocol. The Germans, who had relied on secrecy and careful planning, were watching as the Americans defied every assumption about how logistics should work in a war. They were doing it faster, more efficiently, and without the need for complex planning. What truly set the Red Ball Express apart, however, was its adaptability. When faced with mechanical breakdowns, the Americans didn't wait for weeks for replacements. Instead, they sent out mobile maintenance units, fixing trucks on the side of the road, replacing engines in less than an hour. When trucks were destroyed or abandoned, they were quickly replaced with new ones, often arriving from the U.S. in record time. This ability to overcome mechanical failures and keep the convoys rolling was something the Germans simply could not replicate. But the true psychological impact of the Red Ball Express lay in the sound. German soldiers could hear the constant hum of the engines day and night. It was a sound that never stopped, and it was this relentless noise, this ceaseless march of American trucks that began to wear down the German soldiers. It was a constant reminder that the Americans had unlimited supplies, while the Germans were running low on everything. As the convoys moved through France, they became a symbol of American strength. The French civilians, who had lived under Nazi occupation for so long, began to see the Americans not just as liberators, but as proof of a future that was free from oppression. The trucks, the soldiers, the food, the supplies, everything the Red Ball Express brought symbolized the end of their suffering. And this, too, had an impact on the Germans, who could hear the stories from the occupied population. The French were starting to believe in an American victory, and that belief made their resistance grow stronger. But despite all the successes, the operation wasn't without its cost. Drivers operated under immense pressure, often working for days without rest. The weather, too, took its toll. Snow and ice slowed the trucks down, and yet they kept going. The Germans, despite their best efforts, could not stop the Red Ball Express. Even when winter came, the trucks kept rolling. As the war continued, the Red Ball Express would be remembered as the operation that defied every expectation. It showed that in modern warfare, logistics was just as important as tactics, that supply chains could be the difference between victory and defeat. And it was this simple truth, one that the Germans had underestimated, that ultimately cost them the war. In the fall of 1944, the Red Ball Express had delivered what no one could have predicted: the defeat of the Wehrmacht, not through tanks, artillery, or air superiority, but through the sheer power of logistics. The war, which was supposed to be won by strategic brilliance and battlefield maneuvering, was instead unraveling under the relentless march of American supply trucks. The unrelenting hum of those engines, rolling across France, became a constant reminder to the Germans that they had underestimated the industrial might of America. It wasn't just soldiers who were advancing. It was entire convoys, 6,000 trucks, 23,000 drivers, all pushing forward with an unyielding determination. At 35 miles per hour, the trucks brought victory closer with every turn of the wheels. The Germans had initially laughed at the concept of American logistics. They believed that American supply lines would falter, that the reliance on trucks would collapse under the strain of the war. But those who had once dismissed the Americans now found themselves trapped by the overwhelming power of the Red Ball Express. For 82 days, this unglamorous operation, with its endless convoy of trucks, defied every expectation. It outpaced German calculations, leaving the enemy in a state of disbelief. It wasn't just the scale of the operation that had an impact, it was the sheer audacity. The Germans had spent decades perfecting their own supply systems, yet nothing could match the speed, flexibility, and scale of the Red Ball Express. The Americans had created a logistics system that was constantly evolving, adapting to every challenge. When roads became impassable, they built bypasses. When bridges were destroyed, they constructed new ones, often within a matter of hours. And when their trucks broke down, they didn't wait for replacement parts. Mechanics worked on the side of the road, performing repairs and getting the trucks back on the road within minutes. For the Germans, it was an impossible situation. They had always relied on meticulous planning, careful control, and precise execution. But the Americans had turned this logic upside down. They didn't need to plan everything down to the last detail. They simply trusted in their ability to adapt and overcome. The result was that the Germans were forced to watch, helplessly, as the Americans' logistical network expanded exponentially, outpacing the Germans' ability to destroy it. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially ended its operations, but the legacy of its success would resonate far beyond the end of the war. It was an operation born out of necessity, but its impact on military logistics would change the course of warfare forever. The Germans, once confident in their own superiority, now faced a bitter truth. They had been defeated, not by superior tactics or weaponry, but by an industrial system that could deliver more supplies faster and farther than anything they had ever imagined. What the Germans couldn't comprehend at the time was the scale of American industrial power. They had expected the Americans to fight like any other nation, relying on traditional methods and fighting with standard military tactics. But the United States had approached warfare differently. Logistics were just as important as battlefield tactics. The Red Ball Express was not just about delivering supplies. It was about creating an unbreakable chain of support that would sustain the Allies' momentum, no matter the circumstances. The operation continued for 82 days, delivering 412,093 tons of supplies, traveling over 122 million ton miles. It was a logistical feat that left the Germans in disbelief. They had never seen anything like it. In the end, it wasn't just the sheer volume of supplies that mattered, but the speed at which they were delivered. The Red Ball Express was the difference between life and death on the front lines. The soldiers, their tanks, and their artillery were all supplied faster than the Germans could even react. In the aftermath of the war, the Red Ball Express became more than just a military operation. It became a symbol of American ingenuity, determination, and resilience. It proved that in the modern age of warfare, the ability to deliver supplies could be just as important as the ability to fight. And it was this realization that ultimately led to Germany's defeat. Even today, as we reflect on the Red Ball Express, we can see the profound impact it had on the war. It wasn't about grand strategies or heroic battles. It was about the people who kept things moving. The drivers, mostly African Americans, who worked tirelessly, day after day, in the face of exhaustion, mechanical failure, and impossible conditions. They were the unsung heroes of the war, and their story deserves to be remembered. For those who witnessed it firsthand, the Red Ball Express wasn't just a logistical operation. It was a testament to the spirit of the American people. It showed the world that, when pushed to the limit, they could achieve the impossible. The sound of those engines, the steady hum of progress, became the soundtrack of Allied victory. And for the Germans, the sound of those trucks was a constant reminder that they were fighting an enemy that could outlast, outproduce, and outthink them at every turn. As the war drew to a close, German commanders came to understand a simple truth. Victory was no longer just about tanks or planes. It was about the ability to supply your forces, to keep them moving, to never run out of fuel or ammunition. It was about creating a system that could keep the war machine rolling, no matter what obstacles stood in its way. And for the Germans, who had built their military on efficiency and discipline, this was a lesson they could never unlearn. In the end, the Red Ball Express did more than just supply the front lines. It shattered German morale and crippled their ability to resist. It was the ultimate weapon, the one they hadn't seen coming. The power of industrial logistics, moving at 35 miles per hour, delivering victory one truckload at a time. It was a victory forged not on the battlefield, but in the heart of America's industrial might. And it was this simple truth that ultimately led to the surrender of Nazi Germany and the end of World War II. The sound of the trucks, the constant hum that reverberated across the war-torn landscapes of France, was the sound of history being rewritten. And it was a sound that would forever echo through the annals of military strategy, reminding us that in the modern age, logistics is not just support, it is the strategy, the backbone, the key to victory, and it was the Red Ball Express that proved it.